Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. It was one of those lazy Saturdays when my mom decided it was time for me to do some spring cleaning. Even though it wasn't spring, she figured it was a good time to clear out the attic. I hated the attic. It was dark, dusty, and just had this weird vibe, like something had been forgotten up there for too long. After dragging a few boxes down the creaky stairs, I stumbled across something I hadn't noticed before. There, tucked away behind a stack of old clothes, was a small, leather-bound book. It didn't look like anything special, just a plain, brown cover, no title, no decoration. But something about it made me curious, like it was waiting for me to find it. I brought the diary down to my room, brushed off the dust and opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, and the spine cracked as I flipped through. Every page was blank, except for a faint, lingering smell of something old, like it had been hidden away for decades. I figured I could use it as a journal. After all, why not? I hadn't kept one before, and I thought it might be a good way to pass the time. That night, after finishing my homework and going through the usual teenage routine of mindlessly scrolling through my phone, I decided to write a bit. Just basic stuff. How bored I was, how my mum was on my case about cleaning, how I didn't really want to deal with it. I wasn't exactly pouring my heart out, just venting a little before bed. Afterward, I closed the book, tossed it onto my desk, and went to sleep. The next morning, though, something was off. When I opened the diary, the words I'd written were gone. Instead, the page had new writing, stuff I definitely didn't write. I've been lonely for so long, I watched you find me. I stared at the page, my heart pounding. What the hell was this? Maybe I had written it half asleep and just forgotten. That seemed unlikely, but I couldn't think of another explanation. Shaking my head, I closed the diary and shoved it back in my desk drawer, hoping it was just some weird fluke. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I grabbed the diary again, determined to prove to myself that it was just my imagination. This time, I wrote more deliberately. I'm writing this to make sure nothing changes. If you're reading this tomorrow and it's not my words, something's definitely up. I closed the diary and set it on my desk again. This time, I watched it for a minute before turning off the lights and climbing into bed. I didn't sleep well, tossing and turning, feeling like the air in the room was too heavy, like something was watching me. The next morning, I opened the diary and froze. The words were different again. I told you, I'm here. I slammed the diary shut, my breath catching in my throat. My hands were shaking. I didn't write that. I hadn't even mentioned anything like it, and the handwriting, it looked a lot like mine, but messier, more frantic. I tried to shrug it off, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I shoved the diary back into my drawer and tried not to think about it. But as the day went on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was like the diary was waiting for me to open it again, like it wanted me to keep writing. That night, I couldn't resist. I opened the diary again, but this time, I didn't write anything. I just stared at the blank page, waiting for something to happen. And then, as if on cue, the words began to form on their own. I can see you. I threw the diary across the room, my heart racing. This wasn't just some weird trick of my mind. Something was in that diary, something that wasn't me. I grabbed it again, my fingers trembling, and quickly scribbled, "What do you want?" The page stayed blank for a moment before the ink began to shift. "I want to be free." I stared at the words, my mind racing. What did that mean? Free from what? And why was it talking to me? I didn't have any answers, and I wasn't sure I wanted them. But one thing was clear. The diary wasn't going to leave me alone. Over the next few days, the diary became more persistent. Every morning, the words would change, and every night, I felt like I had no choice but to write back. It told me things I didn't want to know. It knew about my friends, about my family. It even predicted things before they happened. One day, it wrote about my best friend, Julia. It said she was going to stop talking to me. At first, I didn't believe it. But then, out of nowhere, Julia started acting distant. She wouldn't return my texts, and when I asked her what was wrong, she just shrugged and walked away. It was like the diary had already decided our friendship was over. Things got worse from there. The diary started writing about things that terrified me. It mentioned footsteps I hadn't noticed, whispers in the dark, shadows moving in the corners of my room. And every night I could feel it getting closer, like whatever was inside the diary was trying to crawl out. One night, the diary left me a message that I couldn't ignore. You won't survive the week. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept hearing noises, creaks, footsteps, like someone was pacing just outside my door. I locked it, but I knew that wouldn't stop whatever was coming. The next morning, I tried throwing the diary away. I tossed it in the trash, hoping that would be the end of it. But when I got back home that afternoon, it was sitting on my desk again, waiting for me. I didn't know what to do. The fear was consuming me. And then, 2 days later, it gave me one final message. I'm coming for you. That night, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they weren't outside my door. They were inside my room. I hid under the covers, trying to convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination. But I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something watching me. I grabbed the diary, hoping it would stop whatever was happening, but the pages were blank. Just as I was about to close it, the ink started to form again. Look behind you. I didn't want to. I was too scared, but something compelled me to turn around. And that's when everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of my room. The diary was still in my hand, the pages blank once again, but I felt strange. Like I had been asleep for days, even though I knew it had only been a few hours. I didn't know what had happened, but something had changed. I could feel it. I stood up slowly, my body heavy and my mind foggy. The room was silent, too silent. I glanced at the window, expecting to see the morning light, but the sky outside was still pitch black, as if time had frozen in the middle of the night. That's when I noticed something was wrong with the mirror. My reflection looked off. I moved closer, staring at myself. My eyes were hollow, sunken, like I hadn't slept in weeks. But it was more than that. The person looking back at me wasn't me anymore. They were smiling, but my face remained still. A chill ran down my spine. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but my reflection didn't move. It just stood there, grinning, as if it knew something I didn't. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. My voice felt trapped, just like I was. The diary slipped from my hands, landing on the floor with a soft thud. And then, as if it had been waiting for this moment, the words reappeared on the pages, written in a scrawl that was unmistakably my own. I am you now. I stumbled backward, tripping over my feet, crashing into the wall. My head was spinning, my thoughts tangled in confusion and terror. What did it mean? How could it be me? But before I could process it, the reflection in the mirror stepped forward. Not me. It. It stepped out of the mirror, that twisted grin still plastered on its face. I tried to move to run, but my body was frozen in place, as if my muscles had forgotten how to work. The thing that looked like me walked right up to me, its eyes empty and dark, and leaned in close. I could feel its cold breath on my skin. "Thank you for freeing me," it whispered in my voice. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. My entire body felt paralyzed, like I was trapped in my own mind, screaming silently while this thing took over. The last thing I remember was its hand reaching for mine, and then the world went black. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in my room anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, empty, and cold. I could hear voices, faint and distant, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like I was in some sort of limbo, stuck between worlds, trapped in a place I didn't understand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then I saw it, the diary. Floating in the darkness in front of me, its pages flipping on their own, the ink scrawling new words across the page. "Welcome to your new home." I tried to reach for it, but my hand went right through the book, like I was a ghost. I wasn't part of the world anymore. I was just here. And then I understood. The diary hadn't just changed my words, it had changed me. I wasn't me anymore. I was nothing. The thing that had taken my place, the thing wearing my face, was out there, living my life. And I was trapped in this darkness, watching helplessly as it walked in my shoes, spoke in my voice, and lived in my world. Days, weeks, months passed. Time didn't mean anything in that place. All I could do was watch as it continued to write in the diary, changing everything I had ever known. My life became its life, my friends became its friends, and no one noticed. No one knew that I was gone. And then, one day, the diary disappeared from the darkness, and I knew. It had found someone else. It was starting all over again. The first time it happened, I thought nothing of it. Everyone has an off day, right? Even the most skilled archers misjudge a shot now and then. But this was different. It wasn't me, it was the arrow. I remember standing on the practice range, my bow steady in my hands, my eyes locked on the bullseye. I had done this thousands of times before. My muscles knew the movements by heart. My fingers felt the familiar tension of the string pulled back. The arrowhead gleamed in the sunlight as I lined up my shot. I released. Most of the arrows landed dead center, just as they always did. But there was one, a single arrow, that went wide. Not by much, but just enough to make me frown. It veered off to the left, striking the outer ring of the target. I chalked it up to a mistake on my part. I mean, what else could it be? Maybe I wasn't focusing hard enough. Or maybe the wind shifted at the last second. No big deal. Except it happened again. And again. Every session, no matter how perfect my form or how calm the weather was, one arrow refused to obey. It started small, just a slight shift, but after a while, the off-course arrows began to drift farther. Each day, it got worse. I tried everything. New arrows, recalibrating my bow, adjusting my stance, but nothing helped. Then the nightmares began. The first nightmare was subtle. I dreamed I was on the archery range again, the same as always, except this time, the targets were shrouded in a thick fog. I could barely make them out, but I could still feel my fingers pulling back the string. As I let go, the arrows disappeared into the mist. When I walked closer to check my shots, the targets were gone. In their place stood silhouettes, figures, standing silently, unmoving, as if waiting for something. I woke up in a cold sweat, telling myself it was just a dream. But the unease followed me to the range the next day. My hands trembled slightly as I nocked the arrow, but I shook it off. I couldn't let a bad dream mess with my performance. But then it happened again. This time, the arrow flew farther off course than ever before. It didn't just miss the target, it soared past it entirely and landed in the grass behind. I could feel my frustration bubbling up. I marched over, grabbed the rogue arrow, and inspected it closely. It looked fine, normal, even. I tried again. The next arrow flew true, hitting the bullseye with a satisfying thud. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Then came the last shot. I could feel it before I even released it. Something was wrong. The tension in the air was off, like the world had tilted slightly on its axis. My fingers let go, but the arrow didn't follow the path it should have. It twisted in midair, veering hard to the left before slamming into the side of a tree. I didn't want to admit it, but I knew something was wrong. Not just with my shooting. Something else. Something unseen. I tried to laugh it off when I told my coach. He was used to athletes getting into their own heads, overanalyzing their performance. But he just frowned at me and said, "Maybe it's time to take a break, clear your head." I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my head. Something else was interfering with my shots, something beyond my control. I took my coach's advice and avoided the range for a few days, hoping the rest would help. But the dreams returned, and they were worse this time. I was back in the foggy range, but the silhouettes were clearer. They weren't just figures anymore. They were people, faces twisted in ways that didn't look quite right, as if someone had tried to mold them from clay, but stopped halfway. And they weren't just standing still, they were watching me. The worst part, I couldn't wake up. In the dream, I reached for my bow, but it was different, heavier, unfamiliar. The arrows were old, weathered, their shafts crooked, fletchings torn. I aimed at the closest silhouette, but my hands shook. The arrow left the string with a hiss, and I saw it fly true. For once, it flew exactly where I wanted. But the figure didn't fall. Instead, it stepped forward, the arrow embedded in its chest, a sickening smile spreading across its misshapen face. When I finally jolted awake, my heart was pounding, sweat soaking through the sheets. But there was something else, something cold on my arm. I flipped on the bedside lamp and stared in horror at the thin red scratch running down my forearm, right where the string of my bow would have snapped back if I'd missed the release. That wasn't possible. I hadn't been to the range in days. I went back the next day, determined to put the dreams behind me. I had to know if it was all in my head. But as soon as I stepped onto the range, that heady feeling settled over me again, like I was being watched. The sun was shining, but the air felt thick, oppressive, as if something unseen was waiting for me to fail. I went through the motions, trying to calm myself down. Nock, draw, aim, release. The first 2 arrows hit their mark, but I barely noticed. My eyes were fixed on the last arrow, the one that always went wrong. This time, I felt it before I released it. That same strange pull, like the arrow had a will of its own. I tried to fight it, tried to control the shot, but the moment I let go, the arrow twisted in midair, curving hard to the left, slamming into a nearby tree again. But this time, there was something else. I swear I heard a voice. Faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. Missed. I froze, bow still raised. I scanned the area, but there was no one else around. Just the wind rustling the leaves. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching, waiting. That night, the nightmare returned, but this time it was worse. I wasn't just at the range. I was in the woods, running, arrows scattered around me. The figures were no longer distant silhouettes. They were close, too close. They'd whispered as I passed, their voices like dry leaves on the wind. You can't run. I woke up gasping for air, my chest tight, my body drenched in cold sweat. But this time, I wasn't alone. Standing at the foot of my bed was one of the figures from my dreams. Its face twisted in that same grotesque smile, its eyes locked onto mine. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in terror, every muscle locked as it stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. Then it spoke, its voice low and distorted, like something not meant for human ears. Missed. When I woke up, it was morning, and the figure was gone. But the mark wasn't. A thin scratch ran down my leg this time, mirroring the one on my arm. I stopped going to the range after that. I told myself it was just stress, just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew better. Something was wrong, something beyond my control. Weeks passed, and the nightmares faded, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, waiting. I didn't pick up my bow again until a month later. I couldn't avoid it forever. I had a competition coming up, and I couldn't let the fear win. The day of the competition was clear, the air crisp. Perfect conditions. I told myself everything would be fine. I'd worked through the worst of it. I was ready. But as I stood on the line, bow in hand, that familiar unease crept over me. The crowd was silent, waiting, watching. I knocked the arrow, drew back the string, and aimed. But I already knew. Before I even released the arrow, I could feel it pulling, twisting in my grip. I let go, and the arrow flew, veering wildly off course. It didn't just miss the target, it sailed over it entirely, disappearing into the trees beyond. The crowd gasped, and I felt my heart sink. But then I heard it. That voice. The same one from my dreams. Missed. I dropped my bow and backed away from the line, my pulse racing, my skin cold. The crowd didn't seem to hear it, didn't seem to notice the voice that echoed in my head. But I knew. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. The figures from my nightmares, standing at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting. Their twisted faces smiled as they turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone with the whispering wind. I never picked up a bow again after that day. I couldn't, because I knew what would happen. No matter how perfect my aim, no matter how steady my hand, one arrow would always go astray. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the arrow anymore. It was me. I was the one who missed. The nightmares came back that night, more vivid than ever. I wasn't on the archery range this time. I was deep in the forest, the same forest where my arrow had disappeared. The trees were twisted, their branches like crooked fingers reaching for me. And the figures were there, waiting in the shadows, their faces twisted in that unnatural smile, their eyes gleaming with malice. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me felt like quicksand, pulling me down with every step. I could hear them, their voices growing louder, closer. You can't hide. Missed. The whispers filled the air, wrapping around me like a suffocating fog. I couldn't escape. I couldn't wake up. And then I saw it, my bow, lying in the dirt ahead of me. It looked old, weathered, just like in my earlier nightmares. I didn't want to pick it up, but I couldn't stop myself. My hands moved on their own, reaching for the bow, drawing back the string. There was only one arrow left in the quiver. I could feel the weight of it, heavier than it had ever been. The figures stepped closer, their faces looming in the darkness, their voices echoing in my mind. One last shot. I aimed into the void, my arms trembling, sweat dripping down my forehead. The bowstring creaked as I pulled it back. My vision blurred as the world around me seemed to warp, twisting like the faces in the shadows. I released. The arrow flew, cutting through the darkness. For a brief moment, I thought I might hit my mark, that I could finally break free of whatever had cursed me. But then it happened again. The arrow twisted in midair, veering off course, just as it always did. Only this time, I saw where it landed. It hit one of the figures. The silhouette crumpled to the ground, dissolving into shadow, but in its place, something else emerged. Something darker, something more real. It was me. The figure that had fallen was me. My face, my body, lying lifeless in the dirt. The other figures circled around it, around me, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They weren't just watching anymore. They were coming for me. I turned to run, but the ground beneath me gave way. I fell, tumbling into the darkness, the voices of the figures following me down. Missed. When I woke up, I wasn't in my bed. I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the curtains drawn, the room suffocatingly still. My bow was beside me, and the arrow, that arrow, was lodged in the wall, right above my head. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't possible. I hadn't touched my bow in weeks, and yet here it was, right in front of me. The scratch on my arm had grown deeper, red and raw, as if the string had snapped against it moments ago. My head spun, the room closing in around me. I needed air. I needed to get out. But as I turned toward the door, I froze. There, standing in the hallway, was one of the figures from my nightmares. It looked just like it had before, twisted, misshapen, its face a grotesque mockery of a smile. Only this time, it wasn't watching from afar. It was here. I backed away, my mind racing, searching for a way out. But as I moved, more figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows, surrounding me. Their voices whispered in unison, the words crawling under my skin. You can't run. I reached for my bow, knowing it was pointless. There was no escape, no final shot that would save me. The figures closed in, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. The last thing I heard, before the world went dark, was that familiar voice, cold and mocking. Missed. I'm not sure how long I've been here now. Days? Weeks? It's hard to tell. Time doesn't seem to work the same way anymore. The figures are always here, watching, whispering, but never getting closer. I still have my bow, still take aim, but no matter how hard I try, I can't hit the target. One arrow always flies off course, veering into the darkness. And every time it happens, I hear the voice. The same voice, over and over again. Missed. Maybe one day, I'll stop trying. Maybe I'll accept that no matter how hard I aim, no matter how perfect my form, I'll always miss. But not today. I never thought I'd end up raising goldfish. It was just something I picked up after moving to this sleepy town. I had a few tanks, nothing big, just enough to keep me busy. At first, everything was normal. I'd buy the fish, feed them, and make sure they had clean water. But then things started getting strange. It all began with one tank. A 30-gallon, nothing fancy, but every morning it seemed fuller than the night before. At first, I figured I must be imagining things. After all, fish don't just appear out of nowhere. I counted them. 10. The next morning, there were 12. I hadn't bought any new fish, and I hadn't bred them. Still, there they were, swimming as if they'd always been there. I shrugged it off for a while. Maybe I miscounted. But it kept happening. Every day, more fish appeared. I started feeling uneasy, but how do you explain that to anyone? Hey, I think my fish tank is making more fish. I'd sound insane. So I kept quiet, watching the tank grow fuller and fuller. One night, I stayed up late, determined to catch whatever was going on. I set up a chair in front of the tank and waited. Midnight passed, and nothing happened. It was just me and the quiet hum of the filter. I must have dozed off because I woke with a start around 3 a.m. When I looked into the tank, my heart stopped. There were at least 5 new fish swimming around. I hadn't heard a thing. The sight of those new fish gave me a chill I couldn't shake. They were identical to the others, but there was something off about them. Their eyes, too alert, almost like they were watching me, waiting for something. I backed away from the tank, rubbing my eyes, hoping I was just overtired. But the next morning, more fish appeared. Every night, the number grew, and I had no explanation. My other tanks stayed the same, but this one had become something else. I stopped feeding them, thinking maybe the tank would stabilize, but no. The fish didn't die. They just kept multiplying. I did everything I could think of, changed the water, tested the feed levels, even moved the tank to a different part of the room. Nothing worked. And the more I tried to fix it, the more I started noticing other things in the house. Shadows moving where there shouldn't be any, a constant feeling of being watched, even when I wasn't near the tank. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? I couldn't even believe it myself. But then, one night, something new happened. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of splashing water. Groggy, I stumbled to the room where the tanks were kept. The lights flickered on as I entered, and my stomach dropped. Water was spilling out of the tank, soaking the floor. Fish were flopping everywhere, but it wasn't that they had jumped out. No, it was as if the tank couldn't hold them anymore. There were just too many. Dozens of fish, where there had been only 20 or so the day before, now crammed together, wriggling, fighting for space. I scooped up as many as I could, throwing them into another tank, but they just kept coming. Fish, more and more of them. I finally managed to stop the flood, but the tank, my once manageable, serene tank, was overcrowded to the point of madness. The next morning, I called a friend, David. He was a biologist, someone who could take a rational look at things. I didn't tell him the whole story, just that I had some weird situation with the tank and I needed his opinion. He agreed to come over that night. When David arrived, I could tell he thought I was being dramatic. "It's just fish, man," he said with a chuckle. I led him into the room, trying to keep calm. But as soon as he saw the tank, his face went pale. "I don't understand," he muttered. This isn't possible." He examined the tank, checked the filters, even took samples of the water. Nothing was wrong, not scientifically anyway. But then something happened that made both of us freeze. A fish, one of the newest ones, swam right to the glass, pressing its face against it, staring at us. Its eyes, I swear, they looked human. David backed away slowly, shaking his head. "You need to get rid of this tank," he whispered. "Something's not right here." I laughed nervously. "You think I haven't tried?" David left in a hurry that night, saying he'd get back to me with some research. But I knew in my gut that there was no logical explanation for this. These fish, they weren't natural, and they weren't just multiplying. They were watching me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every creak in the house, every flicker of light, made me jump. By 3 a.m., I was back in front of the tank. I didn't even notice it at first, something floating at the bottom. It wasn't a fish. It was something else. I bent down for a closer look, and that's when I saw it. A tiny figure, human-shaped, no bigger than a finger, drifting among the fish. Its eyes were open. I recoiled in horror, stumbling back. My mind was racing. What was happening? What was this thing? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed a net and fished the figure out, holding it up under the light. It was a doll. No, not quite. It looked too real, too detailed, as if it was something that had once been alive. I threw it back into the tank and ran out of the room. This was beyond me. Whatever was going on, I needed help. But it didn't stop. Over the next few nights, I found more figures, more human-like shapes, slowly growing in size. They didn't float anymore. They swam, blending in with the fish, their eyes watching me, tracking my every move. I tried to destroy the tank. I drained the water, broke the glass, even smashed the filter. But the next morning, it was there again, untouched, full of water and more fish, more figures than before. I'm writing this now because I don't know how much time I have left. I've tried everything to stop it, but I can feel it closing in on me. The figures, they're getting bigger. Last night, I found one the size of a child. It pressed its face against the glass, grinning. Its mouth moved, though no words came out. But I understood. It was only a matter of time before they would leave the tank. And I knew, when they did, they would come for me. If you find this, don't come looking for me. Burn this place down. Destroy everything. I was just a fish breeder, but now I'm something else. Something trapped. The tank, it's still growing. As the days passed, I became more and more isolated. I stopped answering my phone. I didn't leave the house, not even for groceries. I couldn't. I was afraid that if I did, the tank would finally spill its contents into the rest of my life. The figures inside were no longer small. They had grown. There were now 3 of them, each more grotesque than the last. They looked like humans, if you squinted, but there was something horribly wrong about their proportions. Too long. Too thin. And their eyes, always those eyes, followed me every time I walked past. I tried to ignore them, to pretend that none of this was happening. But at night, I would hear the soft tapping. It came from the tank, like fingers drumming against the glass, slow and deliberate. At first, it was distant, like it was trying to get my attention. Then it grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding I look. One night, the tapping turned into a full-on pounding. It reverberated through the house, making my heart race. I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, frozen in terror. My brain screamed at me to stay where I was, but my feet had other plans. I found myself walking, almost against my will, toward the room where the tank was kept. The pounding grew louder as I approached. When I finally reached the door, my hand trembled on the knob. I didn't want to open it, but I had to. I had to see. The moment I opened the door, the pounding stopped. The room was deathly quiet, except for the soft hum of the filter. I stared at the tank, waiting for something to happen, and then I saw it. One of the figures, a woman, or at least what used to be a woman, stood at the edge of the tank, pressing her face against the glass. Her eyes, cold and lifeless, locked onto mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. She raised her hand slowly, placing it flat against the glass. Then, without warning, her arm slipped through. I gasped, stumbling back in horror. The glass didn't crack or break, it rippled like water. Her hand, followed by her arm, then her entire body began to push through the surface of the tank, like some kind of nightmare creature crawling out of a mirror. I turned and ran. I sprinted out of the room, down the hall, and into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I grabbed my phone and dialed David's number with trembling fingers. It rang and rang, but no one picked up. I tried again, and again. Still no answer. Panic surged through me. What could I do? Call the police? And tell them what? That there were monsters crawling out of my fish tank. They'd think I was insane. Maybe I was. I heard a soft creak outside my bedroom door, and my heart leaped into my throat. The floorboards. Someone, or something, was walking down the hallway, slowly, deliberately. I pressed myself against the door, holding my breath, listening to the footsteps grow louder and closer. The door handle rattled, and I stifled a scream. Then it stopped. I waited in silence, every nerve in my body on edge. My hand was shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to look through the keyhole. The hallway was empty, but at the far end of the hall, I saw the edge of the tank. It glowed faintly in the darkness, as if the water inside was alive, pulsating with a strange energy. And standing just beside it, I saw her, the woman from the tank, watching me with those lifeless eyes. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The house was no longer mine. I stumbled to the window, my only escape, but it wouldn't budge. It was like something had sealed me inside, trapping me. I tried breaking the glass, but no matter how hard I hit it, the window remained intact, as though it wasn't glass at all, but something much harder, much older. Suddenly, the room grew cold. The air felt thick, like it was being sucked out of the space, leaving me gasping for breath. I turned toward the door, and there she was, standing in the doorway grinning. She wasn't alone. Behind her, more figures emerged, those same twisted, elongated shapes, their wet bodies glistening under the dim light of the hallway. They moved silently, creeping forward like predators stalking their prey. I backed into the corner, nowhere left to run. The woman stepped closer, her mouth moving, though no words came out. But I understood what she wanted, what they all wanted. They weren't here for the tank. They were here for me. With a final gasp, I watched as they reached out, their cold, slimy hands wrapping around my arms, pulling me toward the door. My screams died in my throat as I was dragged back toward the tank. The water rippled and churned, waiting as they forced me closer. I fought, but it was no use. They were stronger than I could have ever imagined. With one last pull, they shoved me forward, and I fell into the water, no, through it, like I had passed through some kind of veil. And then I was inside. It was cold, so cold, and the world outside faded into a blur. I felt myself sinking deeper and deeper into the darkness. Around me, I could see the others, the figures, swimming silently through the water, their faces blank, their eyes empty. I tried to scream, but my lungs filled with water. My vision blurred. My limbs grew heavy. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my own reflection in the glass. But it wasn't me. It was one of them. I've been a magician for as long as I can remember. Disappearing and reappearing in front of an audience was my bread and butter, a trick I'd performed 1,000 times. But something strange started happening the last few times I did it. Every time I reappeared, something was different. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. But I quickly realized this was something far more sinister. The night it all started, I was performing in a small, dimly lit theater downtown. The kind of place where the crowd was close enough to see the sweat on your brow, which meant every move had to be perfect. I'd done my signature disappearing act dozens of times, but something about that night felt off. I locked eyes with the crowd, smiled, and stepped into the box. A simple wave of the hand, and I was gone. Or at least I should have been. When I reappeared, the audience's applause was delayed, confused. I glanced around the room, feeling like something was off. One of the chairs was facing the wrong direction. A small detail, sure, but one I couldn't shake. After the show, I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe the crew accidentally bumped a chair while I was hidden, but the next night, things got weirder. Again, I stepped into the box and disappeared. When I reappeared, the lighting had changed. It was subtle, but I could tell. The soft yellow glow of the spotlight had turned an eerie shade of red. The audience didn't seem to notice, but I did. My heart pounded as I finished the show, and I rushed backstage the moment I could. My assistant, a girl named Emma, looked at me with concern. "You okay?" she asked. I didn't know how to explain it. "Did you notice anything weird with the lights?" She shook her head. Everything was fine. But I wasn't convinced. Something was happening, and it was more than just a trick of the mind. The following week, the changes became more pronounced. Each time I reappeared, something else was different. A painting that had been on the wall was now missing. The curtain, once red, had turned black. And one night, the entire front row of seats had shifted closer to the stage. I knew something was very wrong, but I couldn't stop performing. The disappearing act was my most popular trick, the one that kept people coming back. I couldn't afford to lose my audience. But the real terror came when things started changing that weren't just physical. During a particularly packed show, I performed the trick as usual. But when I reappeared, the audience had changed. Not completely, but subtly. People I had recognized before, the regulars, were gone, replaced by unfamiliar faces. And those who remained seemed off. Their expressions were blank, eyes glassy, as if they were just shells of the people they once were. I hurried through the rest of the performance, my hands trembling as I finished the act. Emma was waiting backstage, but even she seemed different. Her voice was flatter, her movements more mechanical. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I tried to avoid the trick for a while, sticking to simpler illusions, but the audiences kept demanding the vanishing act. The pressure mounted, and I gave in. This time, when I reappeared, the entire room had shifted. The stage had moved, the curtains were gone, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. It felt like I was stepping into a different dimension altogether. The audience wasn't applauding. They were just staring at me with those same hollow eyes. My throat tightened, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something or someone was controlling this, and I had no idea how to stop it. I started avoiding mirrors, afraid of what I'd see. I couldn't shake the feeling that the reflection staring back wouldn't be me. Every time I performed the trick, reality seemed to twist a little more. I consulted a fellow magician, an old friend who specialized in occult illusions. When I told him about the changes, he paled. "You need to stop," he warned. "There are forces at play you don't understand." But I didn't listen. I was in too deep. The last time I performed the trick was in front of a sold-out crowd. I stepped into the box, my palms sweating, heart racing. I knew something was going to happen. I could feel it in my bones. When I reappeared, the entire theater was empty. No audience, no crew, just me. The walls were closing in, the ceiling lowering. I rushed to the backstage area, but Emma wasn't there. It was as if she had never existed. I stumbled back to the stage, and that's when I saw him, a shadowy figure standing in the center of the room. He wore a top hat, much like mine, but his face was hidden in the darkness. "You've crossed over," the figure whispered. His voice was cold, distant. "What do you mean?" I stammered. "Every time you disappeared, you left a part of yourself behind. Now there's nothing left." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped closer, and I realized with horror that his face was mine. "You're not the magician anymore," he said. "You're the trick." In a flash, the lights went out, and when they came back on, I was standing in the box again. But this time, I wasn't performing. I was trapped. I could hear the audience now, cheering, clapping, calling for an encore. But I knew I would never reappear, because I had become the disappearing act. And now, I'm stuck in this endless loop. Every night, I vanish, only to reappear in a different version of the same room. I don't know how long it's been, or how long it will be, but I know one thing: the trick never ends. And the magician? He's gone forever. Time has lost all meaning. Every time I reappear, the room is slightly different. Sometimes the colors shift, other times the objects rearrange themselves in bizarre ways. But it's always the same stage, the same feeling of dread weighing me down. The shadowy figure, my doppelganger, watches me every night, hidden in the crowd. I feel his presence, but he never speaks again. He doesn't need to. I've tried to break free, tried to leave the theater altogether, but no matter where I go, I end up back on that stage. It's as though the world outside no longer exists, or if it does, it's out of my reach. The audience keeps coming. Faceless figures, some familiar, most not. They clap and cheer, but I know they're not real. They're as much a part of the trick as I am now. I refuse to give up. There must be a way out, some way to break the cycle. I've started experimenting with the trick, changing the way I perform it. Sometimes I hesitate before disappearing, hoping that delaying the inevitable will alter the outcome, but it doesn't. Tonight, I'm going to try something different. I'm going to stop halfway through the vanishing act. Maybe if I refuse to complete the trick, I can keep one foot in the real world, hold on to some shred of control. I step into the box. The audience is silent, waiting. My heart pounds as I wave my hand, starting the illusion. I feel a familiar tug of the void pulling me, but this time I'd fight it. For a moment, it seems to work. The room flickers, and I can see both realities, the one I'm trapped in and the one I long to return to. I take a deep breath, holding on to the hope that I might escape. But then I feel it. A cold hand grips my shoulder, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I turn, and my own face stares back at me grinning. The shadowy figure, the one who had taken my place, whispers again, "There's no leaving. You're part of the show now." I know what's coming next. The audience doesn't exist, but they're cheering louder than ever before. The lights flicker, and I feel the stage beneath me dissolve. I try to scream, but no sound comes out. This time, I don't reappear. There's no box, no audience, no theater. Just an endless void stretching in every direction. I am nothing now. Just another part of the trick. The magician has vanished for good. The irony isn't lost on me. I spent my life making things disappear, and now I'm the one who's gone. Lost in a trick of my own making, with no hope of return. If you ever see a magician disappear and reappear, take a moment to wonder, what did they leave behind? Or better yet, what replaced them? Because sometimes the magic is darker than you think. I've always considered myself a practical man. I own a modest jewelry store that's been in my family for generations, tucked away on a quiet street corner. People come in and out, bringing in rings to resize, necklaces to polish, and the occasional heirloom piece that requires special care. It's a comfortable life. Nothing too exciting happens here, at least it didn't, until that diamond showed up. It was a regular Thursday afternoon when she walked in. The woman, maybe in her late 50s, had an air about her that made me feel uneasy from the start. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if every step had been planned. She held a small velvet pouch in her hands, cradling it like it contained something more precious than just a jewel. "I need this polished," she said in a low voice, her eyes never meeting mine. She placed the pouch on the counter gently and slid it toward me. I gave her my usual professional smile, though I could feel something was off. As I opened the pouch, a glittering diamond tumbled into my palm. It was breathtaking. Perfectly cut, but unlike any I had ever seen before. It shimmered in a way that didn't feel right, like it was reflecting light that wasn't even there. "Beautiful stone," I commented, trying to keep my tone steady. "Where did you get this?" The woman didn't answer. She just looked at me for a moment, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then she turned and left the shop. No name, no details, just gone. I shrugged it off. Strange customers weren't unheard of in this business. I figured I'd do my job and get it back to her when she came around. But as I pulled out my polishing cloth and started working on the diamond, something strange happened. The light in the room seemed to shift, almost dimming, and the reflections from the stone bounced around the walls in intricate swirling patterns. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the eye, some weird effect caused by the angle of the light. But the longer I polished, the more the patterns seemed to take on a life of their own. I stopped, blinking, and looked around the room. The walls were covered in what I can only describe as moving shadows, like rippling water, but more organized, more deliberate. They didn't just shift randomly. They'd formed shapes, faces, horrified, contorted faces. My heart started to race. I tossed the diamond onto the counter and stepped back, wiping my hands on my apron as if I could somehow cleanse myself of whatever had just happened. The patterns disappeared almost instantly once I stopped polishing. The light returned to normal, and the shop was as quiet and still as it always had been. I tried to laugh it off. Must be overworking myself, I muttered under my breath, though the words felt hollow. But curiosity gnawed at me. What had I seen? Was it real? The diamond lay innocently on the counter, shimmering in the soft afternoon light, almost daring me to pick it up again. And like a fool, I did. This time, I watched closely as I polished, and sure enough, the strange patterns reappeared, more vivid this time. The faces twisted, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. I could almost feel their anguish, their fear. The walls seemed to close in around me, and for a moment, it was as if the room wasn't the small, familiar space I had known for years, but somewhere else. Somewhere dark. Cold. I dropped the cloth and stumbled back, heart pounding in my chest. The diamond sat on the counter, mocking me. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't very well call someone and tell them I had a haunted diamond in my shop, could I? They'd think I'd lost my mind. So I did what any sensible person would do. I locked it in the safe. Out of sight, out of mind, right? That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces. They were burned into my mind, haunting my dreams. And the worst part, I wasn't alone. I woke up more than once, certain I could hear whispers. Low, almost inaudible, but there. They filled the air with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. When morning came, I went straight to the shop, determined to get rid of the diamond, sell it off, give it back to the woman if I had to. But when I opened the safe, the diamond was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty safe for what felt like an eternity. My hands trembled as I reached inside, feeling around as if the diamond might have slipped into some hidden corner. But it hadn't. It was gone. I swore under my breath and slammed the safe shut, the loud clang echoing through the quiet shop. My mind raced. Had someone broken in? There were no signs of forced entry. No smashed windows or broken locks. And yet the diamond had vanished. I spent the rest of the day pacing the shop, unsure of what to do. The woman hadn't left any contact information, no phone number or address. I had no way of returning it, even if I wanted to. Worse yet, I couldn't stop thinking about those strange patterns, those haunting faces. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, twisted in agony, begging me for something I couldn't understand. As evening approached, a thick sense of dread settled in my chest. The shop seemed darker than usual, the lights dimmer. The air felt heavy, as though it was pressing down on me. I glanced toward the safe, half expecting the diamond to reappear, but it stayed locked tight. That's when I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I turned toward the source of the sound, my heart hammering in my chest. The whisper grew louder, clearer. It was coming from the walls. No, not from the walls, from the patterns. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The faces I had seen reflected in the light were back, but this time they weren't confined to the walls. They were moving, crawling across the floor, stretching toward me with gnarled fingers. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror, and the whispers, they were clearer now. Words I couldn't understand, but they echoed in my mind, filling me with a deep, paralyzing fear. I bolted for the door, but it slammed shut in front of me with a deafening bang. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct telling me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The shop seemed to close in around me, the walls shrinking, the faces multiplying. They were everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, watching me, judging me. I staggered back, collapsing into a chair, my breathing shallow. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But the faces, the whispers, were all too real, and they weren't going away. Then, through the chaos, I heard a knock. It was faint at first, barely noticeable over the sound of my own rapid heartbeat. But then it came again louder. A steady, deliberate knock on the front door. I stood up, legs shaking, and moved toward the door as if in a trance. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the knocking growing louder with every step. When I finally opened the door, my breath caught in my throat. It was the woman, the one who had brought the diamond. Her eyes were different this time, dark, hollow, as if the life had been drained from her. She didn't speak, but the moment our eyes met, I knew why she was here. The diamond was hers, but it wasn't just an ordinary gem. It had a purpose, a dark, twisted purpose. She stepped inside without a word, and I found myself backing away, helpless to stop her. She walked straight to the counter where the diamond had been, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she pulled it from her pocket. It shimmered in the dim light just as it had before. But now I could see it clearly. Inside the diamond, trapped within its flawless cut, were the faces. The same faces that had haunted me, twisted in agony, screaming silently for help. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. What? What do you want from me? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, a cold, lifeless smile that chilled me to the bone. It's not about what I want, she said, her voice hollow and distant. It's about what they want. Before I could react, she placed the diamond on the counter and turned to leave. But as she reached the door, she paused, looking back at me one last time. You shouldn't have touched it, she said quietly. Now it's yours. And then she was gone. The shop was silent again, but the air felt heavier than ever. I stared at the diamond, its light flickering and casting those same horrific patterns on the walls. I wanted to run to get as far away from it as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the knowledge of what was to come. The whispers returned, louder this time, clearer, and as the faces swelled around me, I realized the truth. They weren't just reflections. They were trapped. And now, so was I. The diamond had claimed them, just as it would claim me. I could feel it already, the pull, the darkness closing in. My vision blurred, and the world seemed to fade away, swallowed by the shadows. And then, there was nothing but silence. I never believed in ghosts. I'd hear stories from customers now and then, a haunted house, an eerie encounter, a shadow in the corner of their eye, but I always brushed them off. I was a barista at Cafe Grove, a little shop that's been around for as long as anyone can remember. It was cozy, with mismatched furniture, warm lighting, and the faint smell of roasting coffee beans in the air. I liked it. I liked the regulars too. People came and went, and most of them were good company. But there was one thing that always unsettled me, and I didn't notice it until I'd been working there for a few months. There was this one cup of coffee, just a simple black coffee, that always came back, untouched. At first, I didn't think much of it. People change their minds, maybe leave in a hurry, or they just don't like the taste. It happens, but this was different. It started with a man. I remember his face, round glasses, neatly combed hair, a suit that looked expensive. He came in, ordered a black coffee, and sat by the window. I watched him from behind the counter as he flipped through his phone, but never once did he take a sip. When he left, the cup was still full, the steam curling lazily toward the ceiling. Strange, I thought, but I didn't dwell on it. Then it happened again. A woman this time. She was younger, in her 20s maybe, with a bright yellow scarf. She ordered a black coffee, same thing. Sat down by the same window, didn't touch it. Just like the man before her, she left with the coffee untouched. I started keeping track after that. Every few days, someone would come in, order that same black coffee, sit in the same seat, and leave it untasted. It was always different people, but the pattern was identical. I couldn't explain it, and the more it happened, the more it started to gnaw at me. I told my coworkers about it, but they just laughed it off. "You're overthinking it," they said. "People leave drinks all the time." Maybe they were right, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I became obsessed. I started to look forward to the next customer who'd order the untasted coffee. I'd watch them closely, trying to see if there was anything strange about them. But they were always normal, ordinary. Then, one evening, everything changed. It was a slow night, just a few customers scattered around the shop. I was working the closing shift, tired but alert. The door chimed, and in walked a man. Tall, thin, with a face that seemed too sharp for his head. He wore an old trench coat, the collar turned up to hide most of his face. He didn't look at me when he walked up to the counter. "Black coffee," he said. His voice was low, almost a whisper. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I made the coffee, my hands shaking just a little, and handed it to him. He took it without a word and sat down at the same table by the window. For the next hour, he just sat there, staring out the window, the cup untouched in front of him. When I went to clean up after closing, the cup was still there, untasted as usual. But this time, there was something else. A note folded neatly and placed under the cup. I hesitated before picking it up. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. "Tomorrow, you'll know," the note read. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the note, about the man, and about that damn cup of coffee. What was supposed to happen tomorrow? Was it some kind of threat, or a warning? The next day, I showed up to work early. I wanted to get ahead of whatever was going to happen. The shop opened like any other day. Regulars came in, ordered their usuals, chatted about the weather. Everything seemed normal, but I was on edge. Then, in the early afternoon, it happened. A woman walked in tall, with long, dark hair. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes sunken and her skin pale. She ordered a black coffee. My heart pounded as I made it. When I handed it to her, our eyes met. I felt a chill run down my spine. She took the coffee and, like the others, sat down at the window. I watched her for what felt like hours, but in reality, it was only a few minutes. She didn't take a sip. Then, without warning, she stood up and left, leaving the coffee untouched. But when I went to clear the table, the cup wasn't there. I searched the whole shop, but it was gone. It had vanished. That night, I stayed late to close up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. As I was mopping the floor, I heard the bell above the door chime. I looked up, and there he was, the man in the trench coat. He didn't say a word. He just walked over to the counter and pointed at the coffee machine. I didn't move. My heart was racing, and my hands were clammy. He pointed again, and I knew what he wanted. Slowly, I made the coffee, my hands shaking as I handed it to him. He didn't sit down this time. He just stood there, staring at me, the cup in his hand. And then, without taking a sip, he turned and walked out the door. I never saw him again. But from that day on, every cup of black coffee I served felt different. Heavier, like it carried some kind of curse. And the worst part, every night when I closed up, I'd find that same untasted cup of coffee waiting for me on the counter, no matter how many times I threw it away. I still work at Cafe Grove, but I don't serve black coffee anymore. I can't. I don't know what happened, but I'm not willing to find out. Some things are better left untasted. After that night, my life changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. The black coffee still showed up at the counter every night, untouched, no matter how many customers I served or how many cups I washed. I started to dread the end of my shifts, knowing it would be there, waiting for me like some kind of taunt. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of my mind. I was overworked, tired. Hallucinations weren't unheard of, right? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the truth was undeniable. Every night, without fail, that cup was there. It was messing with my head. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of that coffee cup. Why was it untasted? Who or what was leaving it there? And why me? I started asking the regulars if they noticed anything strange, but they all shook their heads. No one had seen the man in the trench coat again, and no one seemed to know anything about the customers who left without touching their drinks. It was like they vanished after stepping out of the shop. Desperate for answers, I took my search online. Forums, paranormal websites, you name it. But nothing came close to what I was experiencing. The closest I got was a thread about cursed objects and how spirits sometimes attach themselves to mundane things. Was the coffee cup cursed? But why would it keep coming back? Weeks went by, and the tension in my chest grew heavier. Then one night, something different happened. I was closing up as usual when the doorbell chimed again. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to look up. I didn't want to see who or what was standing there. But I had to. Standing at the door was the woman with the long dark hair, the one who had left her coffee untouched. Only this time she wasn't pale. She looked dead. Her eyes were hollow, her skin sagging like it was barely holding onto her bones. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. I knew why she was there. I tried to move, but my legs felt like lead. She stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound on the tile floor. The only sound was the steady drip of something thick and dark from her hands. Blood. She reached the counter, and for the first time, I saw it. In her hands was the cup. The same black coffee, untasted. No, I whispered, backing away. Please no. But she didn't stop. She placed the cup gently on the counter, her bony fingers lingering over it like she was savoring the moment. Then, slowly, her face twisted into a smile. A smile so wide it split her lips. You served it, she said, her voice a ragged whisper. Now you must taste it. My heart was pounding in my chest. I shook my head, stepping further away, but she didn't move from the counter. Her eyes locked onto mine, and her smile grew wider, more grotesque. The cup sat there waiting. My back hit the wall. There was nowhere else to go. The shop was empty, the lights dim, and the woman, if I could still call her that, wasn't going to leave until I did what she asked. My throat was dry, my hands shaking as I reached for the cup. The moment my fingers touched the ceramic, the room went cold. The air felt heavy, thick, like I was underwater. I wanted to drop the cup, to run out of the shop and never look back. But I couldn't. Something made me bring the cup to my lips. The coffee was ice cold, bitter. It tasted wrong, like ash and something else I couldn't place. But I drank it. I drank it all, every last drop, as her dead eyes watched me. When I finished, I dropped the cup. It shattered on the floor, but she didn't react. Her smile faded, and for the first time since she walked in, she spoke clearly. Now you will serve. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and walked out of the shop. I stood there, trembling, the shattered pieces of the cup at my feet. I could still taste the bitter coffee on my tongue, and for the first time, I realized what had happened. I was cursed. From that night on, I no longer just served the coffee, I became part of the cycle. Every night, I'd see new faces walk in, order that same black coffee, and sit by the window. I'd watch as they left without tasting it, and when I closed up, the cup would be there waiting for me. I couldn't quit. The shop wouldn't let me. I tried to leave, tried to run far away, but no matter where I went, I always ended up back at Cafe Grove. Every road led back to that cursed place. I'm stuck now, trapped. Every night I serve the untasted coffee, and every night it comes back. I don't know what happens to the people who leave without drinking it. Maybe they're cursed too, doomed to wander forever like me. Or maybe something worse happens to them. All I know is that I can't stop. I have to keep serving. Because if I don't, the next person to leave the coffee untasted will be me. I've been a silversmith for over 2 decades, and in all that time, I've prided myself on the precision of my work. Each bracelet, necklace, or ring I crafted bore a piece of my soul, reflecting the care I put into every detail. But there's something about this one client, Sarah Winters, that chills me to my core. I met Sarah about a year ago in my small workshop nestled in the quieter side of town. She seemed like any other customer at first, polite, reserved, with an eye for intricate designs. But after the first piece of jewelry I made for her, something odd happened. A scratch, tiny but unmistakable, appeared on the surface of the bracelet I'd crafted. It wasn't there when I handed it to her, of that I'm certain. Yet when she brought it back the next day, claiming the defect had appeared right after she put it on, I couldn't explain it. I apologized profusely, fixed the scratch, and thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. A few weeks later, Sarah commissioned another piece, this time a necklace with a delicate silver pendant. I spent hours perfecting the intricate design, making sure every curve and detail was flawless. But when she returned, again, the pendant had the same kind of scratch as before. It was almost in the exact same spot too. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jewelry doesn't just scratch itself. I began to grow uneasy, but I brushed it off. I'm a rational man after all. Maybe I'd missed something during the final polish, I thought. Maybe it was just an odd coincidence. But it kept happening. Each time Sarah returned, she ordered something new, rings, earrings, brooches, and each time, after delivery, the same scratch appeared. No other client of mine ever had these issues, just Sarah. And always that same small scratch. I started feeling anxious whenever she walked into my shop. There was something in the way she looked at me, a cold, expectant stare that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Her eyes lingered just a little too long on my hands, as if watching for something to happen. It's hard to explain, but I felt like I was being judged, not just for my work, but for something deeper. One evening, after closing up the shop, I sat alone at my workbench, staring at a half-finished ring Sarah had requested. It was late, and the only sound in the workshop was the ticking of the old clock on the wall. My tools lay scattered across the table, glinting in the dim light. As I began to work again, a sudden chill swept through the room, sending a shiver down my spine. The temperature had dropped, but there was no draft, no window open. I tried to focus, but my hands began to tremble. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then, darkness. For what felt like an eternity, I sat in pitch black, the silence almost deafening. My heart pounded in my chest, and I gripped the ring in my hand so tightly I could feel the edges pressing into my skin. And then, just as suddenly as they'd gone out, the lights flickered back on. I glanced down at the ring in my hand, and there it was, the scratch. I hadn't even finished the piece. There was no way the scratch should have been there, yet it was as clear and deliberate as ever. My hands were shaking now. This wasn't a coincidence anymore. Something was wrong. Something beyond my understanding. After that night, everything changed. I couldn't focus. The shop, once my sanctuary, had become a place of dread. I dreaded Sarah's visits. I dreaded my own work. Every time I touched a piece of silver, my mind wandered to the scratches, the darkness, the flickering lights. And Sarah, she kept coming back. Each time, she'd greet me with the same unnerving smile, the same cold eyes, and the same request for another piece of jewelry. And every time, I found myself hoping it would be the last. One evening, after another unsettling encounter with Sarah, I decided I needed answers. I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. I needed to know more about her, who she was, where she came from, and why this was happening. I searched through old records, but found nothing, no social media presence, no online traces, no local history. It was as if she didn't exist outside of our interactions. Frustrated, I decided to confront her the next time she came into the shop. I would demand an explanation, even if it meant risking my reputation or my sanity, but I never got the chance. A week later, Sarah placed another order, a bracelet this time. I crafted it with extra care, making sure every millimeter was flawless, praying that somehow this would be the end. But when I handed it to her, she smiled again. "Beautiful work," she said, in that same emotionless tone. "But we both know it won't stay that way." The words chilled me to the bone. I tried to hide my unease, but it was too late. She saw it in my eyes, and her smile widened just a fraction. "Why are you doing this?" I blurted out, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, as if considering my question. Then, after a moment of silence, she replied, "It's not about what I want, it's about what's owed." I stared at her, confused and terrified. Owed? What was she talking about? Before I could ask, she turned and walked out of the shop, leaving me standing there, my heart racing. I wanted to chase after her, demand an explanation, but something in me, some primal instinct, told me to stay put. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying her words in my mind, trying to make sense of them. What was owed? I'd never wronged her. I barely knew her. Then, at around 3 a.m., as I lay wide awake in bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Sarah. "Come to my house. You'll understand." I didn't want to go. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to ignore the message, to stay as far away from her as possible. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to grab my coat, step out into the cold night, and make my way to the address she had sent. Her house was on the outskirts of town, an old, decrepit building I'd never noticed before. The windows were dark, the air around it still. I hesitated at the door, but then I knocked. Once. Twice. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a narrow hallway bathed in dim light. "Sarah?" I called out, my voice echoing in the emptiness. There was no reply. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls were lined with strange old paintings, images of people, their faces blurred, their eyes hollow. The farther I walked, the heavier the air became. It felt like the house was closing in on me, the walls tightening, the darkness creeping closer. Finally, I reached a room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and from inside, I could hear a faint metallic scraping sound. I pushed the door open, and there she was, Sarah, sitting at a small table in the center of the room. In front of her was a silver bracelet, the same one I'd made for her earlier that week, and in her hand, a sharp silver knife. Without looking up, she spoke. "You should have never taken the silver from them." My breath caught in my throat. "What are you talking about?" She finally looked up, her eyes dark and hollow. "The silver you use, it's cursed, stolen. Every piece you make is a reminder of a debt unpaid, and every scratch is a warning." I stumbled back, my mind racing. Stolen silver? Cursed? This was madness. "You took it from the wrong hands," she continued, her voice eerily calm. "And now it's time to pay." Before I could respond, the lights flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. I heard the scraping of the knife, the sound of footsteps approaching. I turned to run, but something cold wrapped around my wrist. When I looked down, I saw it, another scratch, deep and fresh, carved into my skin like the ones on the jewelry. I screamed, pulling away, but it was no use. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me leave. The walls closed in, the air thick with the smell of burning silver. And then, silence. When I woke, I was back in my shop, sitting at my workbench, as if nothing had happened. But my hands, they were covered in scratches, deep, unhealed. And Sarah's jewelry, it was gone. Every piece, every trace of her, vanished. I never saw her again. But the scratches, they never went away. Every night, new ones appeared, on my skin, on my tools, on anything I touched. I tried to stop making jewelry, but it didn't matter. The silver, it had claimed me. Now, I live in constant fear, knowing that one day, the debt will be paid in full. And when that day comes, I know I won't survive. I've been boxing for years. It's all I've known since I could throw a punch. The thud of gloves hitting flesh, the roar of the crowd, those things kept me going. But recently, something strange has been happening. Every time I step into the ring, there's a shadow that follows me. No, not my shadow. This thing, it's different. The first time I noticed it was a few weeks back. I was sparring in the gym late at night, trying to shake off the nerves before an important fight. I chalked it up to exhaustion, maybe a trick of the overhead lights. But when I pivoted left, the shadow didn't move with me. I stood still, catching my breath, watching as it flickered, staying out of sync with my body. It looked like me, but taller, bulkier. I shook it off and went back to work. Nothing more than pre-fight jitters, I told myself. But it wasn't. The real trouble started on fight night. Big crowd, bright lights, all eyes on me. My opponent was good, strong and fast, everything I expected. What I didn't expect was that damned shadow. I remember bouncing on my toes in the corner, waiting for the bell to ring. My breath was steady, my mind sharp, but the shadow, it was there again. Looming on the mat in front of me, darker than before, like a stain no amount of light could get rid of. I glanced up at the lights, but nothing was casting that kind of shadow. It was just me in the ring, and the thing that had attached itself to my feet. I was unnerved, but I had to focus. The bell rang, and we started trading blows. I tried to ignore it, but with every punch, every dodge, the shadow moved like it was boxing me, matching my moves but somehow anticipating them. I could feel it there, behind me, lurking. By the third round, I could barely keep up with my opponent. My legs felt heavy, my arms slower than usual. My trainer screamed at me to keep my head in the game, but I couldn't. The shadow was draining me, sapping my strength with every step. That's when I got hit. Hard. Knocked down flat on the mat. For a second, everything was black. But as I lay there, gasping for air, I saw it, right above me. The shadow. It was crouched over me like it was waiting for something. The ref's voice broke through, counting down. I forced myself up, but that feeling of dread never left. I won the fight barely. But victory didn't feel like victory. It felt wrong. As if something had shifted inside me, something dark. For days after, I tried to forget about it. People congratulated me, but the weight of that shadow stayed with me. I saw it in reflections, following me home. In the shower, on the streets, no matter where I went, it was always there. I went to the gym one night, thinking maybe working through it would help. That's when I saw it again, only this time it wasn't on the mat. It was in the mirror. I froze. My reflection was still, but the shadow in the mirror wasn't. It moved, pacing back and forth behind me like a predator stalking prey. Then it smiled. I didn't sleep that night. The next fight came sooner than I was ready for. I didn't want to get back into the ring, but I couldn't back down either. Everyone was watching. My opponent this time was faster, younger. I could feel the pressure building. But worse than that, I could feel the shadow watching. When I stepped into the ring, the shadow was already there, waiting for me like an old friend. But it wasn't the same anymore. It had grown. Taller, bulkier, and more defined. Every time I swung, it swung too, but faster, sharper. It wasn't just following me. It was leading. I was losing control. I couldn't keep up. My punches landed slower, my footwork felt clumsy. I was fading, and the shadow, it was thriving. By the final round, I could barely see straight. My opponent hit me with everything he had. I went down again, crashing to the mat. This time, I couldn't get up. But before the ref could even start counting, the shadow stepped over me. It leaned in close, and for the first time, I heard it whisper. It told me to stay down. I retired after that. I couldn't do it anymore. Every time I walked past a gym, the shadow was there watching. I didn't talk about it to anyone. Who would believe me? The nightmares started not long after. Every night, I'd dream about being in the ring. No crowd, no lights, just me and the shadow. I'd swing, it'd swing back, and every time it hit me, it felt real. Too real. I'd wake up gasping, covered in sweat, but even then, I could feel it in the room with me. It was getting closer. I thought I could outrun it. I moved out of my apartment, started training in secret, hoping to fight whatever this thing was. But you can't fight something that isn't real, can you? Or maybe it was real. I went back to the ring one last time, late at night when the gym was empty. I needed to face it. I needed to see if I could win. But as soon as I stepped into the ring, I knew. The shadow wasn't just some figment of my imagination. It was me. Or at least it wanted to be. I stood in the center of the ring, staring down at the mat. The shadow spread out in front of me, taller and stronger than ever. And then it moved. It stepped forward, one slow, deliberate pace at a time, until it was right in front of me. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. The shadow raised its hand, mirroring mine, and for the first time, I realized something horrible. It wasn't following me. It was waiting to take my place. And that's when I felt it. A punch harder than anything I'd ever experienced, right to my chest. My heart skipped, my breath caught, and everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, I was still in the ring, but the gym was darker, colder. The shadow was gone, but I knew it was still with me. I looked down at my hands. They weren't mine anymore. I wasn't myself anymore. I had lost. And now, I was the shadow. The days after that night were a blur. I stopped seeing people, stopped going out. I couldn't handle it anymore, the whispers, the shadows lurking in the corners of every room I entered. They weren't just in the ring anymore, they followed me everywhere. I knew deep down that I wasn't me anymore. My movements were slower, more deliberate, as if something else was pulling the strings. I caught glimpses of myself in the mirror, but it wasn't really me looking back. The eyes were darker, the smile wasn't mine. The shadow had one, and I had become it. No one noticed the change. To them, I was still the same boxer, the guy who used to light up the ring. But I wasn't. I was something else now, something hollow, walking through life like a puppet on strings. It didn't take long before I found myself drawn back to the ring. One more fight, I thought. Just one more, to see if I could still control it. To see if I was still me. I knew it was a lie, but I had to try. The gym was empty when I stepped in, the lights casting long, eerie shadows on the mat. I could feel it, the thing that had taken over me, shifting inside, ready for the final round. I stood in the center of the ring waiting, and there it was. The shadow. No longer a vague figure, it was me, fully formed, stepping into the ring like an opponent ready to finish what it had started. But this time, there were no punches, no dodges. I didn't fight. I couldn't. It was too late. The shadow raised its hand, mirroring my stance, and for a moment, we stood face to face. Identical. And then it smiled. That smile, that was the last thing I remember. It was over. I wasn't me anymore. I had become the shadow. I've heard people talk about me since then, about how I've changed. How I never show up for anything, never go near the gym. I avoid people, avoid mirrors, avoid life. Because every time I see my reflection, it's not me. It's the shadow. And now, the ring? It's still there, waiting for its next victim. The shadow doesn't need me anymore. It's found a new fighter to haunt, a new soul to take. But the worst part, it's still inside me, a part of me forever. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, I can never escape it. I am the shadow now. And the ring? It never lets you go. I've been sketching caricatures on the same street corner for years. The kind of place tourists flock to, eager to see their exaggerated faces on paper. But a couple of months ago, things changed. I started drawing a face that tore my paper every single time. And nobody had any answers. It started innocuously enough. A man sat down at my easel, just like any other customer. But as I outlined his face, the paper ripped right across. At first, I laughed it off as an accident, replaced the sheet, and started again. But the paper ripped again. And again. The man left frustrated, but I thought it was nothing more than bad luck. After that day, every time I tried to draw that same face, a face I never could fully remember, it would tear my paper apart. No matter who I was drawing, if the features even slightly resembled that face, my pencil would slice through the page. I was losing customers because of it. No one wants to pay for a ruined caricature. I started to get nervous. It was affecting my work. I even went to an art supply store, thinking maybe I was using the wrong materials. Maybe it was the paper or the pencils, I reasoned. But no matter what I used, the same face kept appearing, and the paper would always tear. I asked around, my friends, other street artists, even old-timers who'd been in the business longer than me. But nobody had ever heard of anything like this happening. Just bad technique, they'd say. Maybe you're pressing too hard. But I knew it wasn't me. Something else was going on. One day, after yet another failed drawing, I decided to keep a notebook. Each time the paper tore, I'd try to sketch the face in my private sketchbook just to get an idea of what was happening. The strange thing was, I couldn't remember the face at all, even though I was staring right at the person in front of me. It was like the moment I tried to recall it, my mind went blank. But when I started to sketch, the same vague features would come out: strong jawline, hollow cheeks, piercing eyes. Days turned into weeks. The face kept coming back. It didn't matter who sat in front of me, man, woman, child. Somehow their features would morph into that same unshakable face. And every time, the paper would rip just as I was about to finish. One night, as I flipped through my sketchbook, I noticed a pattern. The face seemed to be getting clearer, more defined with each attempt. It was as if the more I sketched, the closer I got to understanding it. But I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Then came the night I saw him. I was packing up, ready to call it a day, when a figure appeared at the edge of my booth. He was tall, with a dark coat and a hood pulled low over his face. At first, I thought he was just another late-night customer. But when he pulled the hood back, my heart stopped. It was him. The face I had been drawing. He didn't say anything, just sat down and stared at me. My hand trembled as I picked up my pencil. I knew I shouldn't draw him, but I couldn't help it. My hand moved on its own, like it had a mind of its own. The paper didn't rip this time. I finished the drawing, and for the first time, I saw the face clearly. His eyes were dark, hollow pits, and his mouth twisted into a smile that chilled me to my core. I looked up, ready to hand him the sketch, but he was gone. I blinked, confused. My booth was empty. The street was silent. I checked the time. Only a few minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. When I looked down at the drawing, the paper had torn itself into shreds. My sketchbook was ruined, every page ripped apart, except for one, the one with his face. After that night, I stopped sketching. I couldn't risk drawing that face again, but even though I abandoned my booth, the face stayed with me. It haunted my dreams, my waking moments. Everywhere I looked, I saw him. In reflections, in crowds, even in the shadows of my own home. I don't know who he is or why he's after me. But I know one thing for sure: every time I see that face, something terrible happens. People disappear, accidents occur, strange things that no one can explain. I've been trying to avoid drawing for weeks now, but I can't escape it. My hands itch to hold a pencil, to put that face on paper once more. And I know the moment I do, it'll be the last time. So, if you're reading this, take my advice. Never draw a face you can't remember. Because some faces aren't meant to be sketched. Some faces tear through reality itself. And some faces never let go. I tried to move on with my life, but it became impossible. No matter where I went, I saw him. Sometimes it was just a glimpse, a shadow passing by, or a figure at the edge of my vision. Other times he was there, staring at me from across the street, unmoving, just like the first night. I started to isolate myself, too scared to be around other people. I quit sketching altogether. I thought if I stopped, maybe he would leave me alone. But it didn't work. The face had attached itself to me, woven into the fabric of my life. The dreams were the worst. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and his face, the face I'd drawn so many times, would be burned into my mind. In the dreams, I was always drawing, but the paper never ripped. Instead, the face would come to life, pulling itself off the page and into the world, its hollow eyes staring straight into my soul. I couldn't take it anymore. Something had to give. I decided I would confront him. If he was real, I needed to know. Maybe if I could finish the drawing, really finish it, without the paper ripping, I could put an end to this nightmare. One night, I set up my old booth on the street corner where it all began. The night was colder than usual, and the street was quieter than I remembered. I sat down, my hands trembling as I laid out a fresh sheet of paper. Hours passed and no one came, but I knew it wasn't over yet. I just had to wait. Sure enough, around midnight I saw him. He didn't come out of the shadows this time. He walked right up to my booth, as if we had been expecting each other. He sat down, his cold, dark eyes fixed on me. I took a deep breath, picked up my pencil, and began to draw. The lines came naturally, like they always did. But this time, the paper didn't tear. I was finally able to finish the sketch. His face, the same face I had seen countless times, was there, perfectly captured on the page. I looked up, ready to confront him, but once again he was gone. I stared at the drawing, confused. It was finished, but something felt wrong. The eyes. They seemed to be watching me, moving on their own. I blinked, trying to shake off the feeling. But when I looked again, the face was no longer just a sketch. It was moving. Slowly, subtly, but undeniably. The pencil lines began to shift, and the paper started to crumple in on itself, folding like a living thing. I tried to tear the page, to stop whatever was happening, but it wouldn't rip. The paper had become something else, something alive. Suddenly, the page burst into flames, burning bright but cold to the touch. I should have been panicking, but I was frozen, unable to move as the fire consumed the drawing. The flames danced across the page, leaving nothing but ash behind. But as the last piece of paper disintegrated, I heard a voice, low and whispering, right behind me. "Now you're finished." I spun around, but no one was there. The street was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and a cold chill ran down my spine. I thought it was over, that maybe destroying the drawing had set me free. But when I turned back to my easel, my blood ran cold. There, in the pile of ashes where the drawing had been, was a new sheet of paper. And on that paper was a drawing, my face. The features were unmistakable, but the eyes were hollow, and the smile was twisted into something dark, something that didn't belong to me. As I stared at the drawing, the paper began to crumple, just like it had before. My own face was tearing itself apart, piece by piece. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. It was like I was trapped, forced to watch as my own image was ripped apart, my face being destroyed in front of me. And then, the paper stopped tearing. That's when I felt it. A hand, cold and firm, resting on my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. He was here. And now, he was the one drawing me. I don't remember much after that. Just the sensation of being pulled, torn apart, like the paper. But I know one thing for sure, I'm no longer just a street artist. I'm part of the drawing now. And every time someone picks up a pencil, ready to sketch a face they can't quite remember, I'm there, waiting. Soccer has always been my life. Every kick, every pass, every goal, it all defined who I was. But something changed recently, something I can't quite explain. It started a few months ago, right in the middle of the season. At first, I thought it was nerves or a trick of the mind. Now, I'm not so sure. It was just an ordinary game like any other. I had scored the winning goal, my specialty really. The crowd went wild, chanting my name, cheering, celebrating. I did my usual victory lap, arms raised, soaking it all in. That's when I noticed it. In the middle of the crowd, amid the sea of joy, stood a figure, motionless, silent. No applause, no cheers, no movement at all. It was as if they didn't belong. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but the figure remained, staring directly at me. At first, I shrugged it off. Soccer stadiums hold thousands of people, and not everyone gets caught up in the excitement. Maybe it was just someone having a bad day, right? But the next game, it happened again. Another goal, another win, another celebration, and there they were, standing in the same spot. This time, I couldn't ignore it. Something about them felt wrong. After that second game, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking it, but I knew better. The figure wasn't just a coincidence. They were there for a reason, and I had to find out why. I started paying more attention during the games, scanning the crowd whenever I had a chance. It didn't take long for the pattern to emerge. Every time I scored, they were there. Always standing in the same section of the crowd, always staring right at me. No cheering, no signs of excitement, just watching. It wasn't just their stillness that bothered me, it was their appearance. I could never see their face clearly, like it was hidden in the shadows, despite the bright stadium lights. They wore a long coat, the kind you'd see in an old movie, out of place in a sea of team jerseys. And their eyes, well, I couldn't even be sure they had eyes. But I felt them. I felt their gaze burn into me every time I looked their way. At first, I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? Hey, there's a creepy figure in the crowd every time I score a goal. It sounded ridiculous. But as the weeks went by, the figure started haunting me off the field too. I'd see flashes of them in the most unexpected places, at the grocery store, walking down the street, even at my apartment window late at night. Always standing still, always watching. I couldn't sleep. The image of them was burned into my brain. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that same figure. It got so bad that I started dreading scoring goals. And I love scoring goals. But now it felt like a curse. During one particular game, everything escalated. It was an important match. Our team was neck and neck with our rivals, and I knew the game could go either way. When I scored the first goal, I hesitated to look at the crowd, but I couldn't help myself. There they were in the same spot, just staring. I forced myself to focus on the game. I wasn't going to let some weird shadowy figure ruin this for me. But as the match wore on, my heart pounded faster, not from the physical effort, but from fear. I could feel the figure's presence, stronger than ever before, even though they hadn't moved an inch. Then I scored the final goal, sealing our victory. The stadium erupted in cheers. My teammates rushed toward me, and I raised my arms like I always did. But this time, something was different. The figure wasn't in the crowd anymore. They were standing on the field. I froze, my mind racing. They were closer than ever before, only a few yards away. No one else seemed to notice. My teammates laughed and hugged each other, oblivious to the strange figure standing in the middle of the celebration. I stared, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure raised their hands slowly, pointing directly at me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry. My legs felt like they were sinking into the ground. I couldn't move. Suddenly, they turned and walked off the field, disappearing into the shadows of the stadium tunnel. I stood there, stunned, barely aware of the world around me. My teammates were pulling me along, cheering, celebrating, but I wasn't really there. My mind was still on that figure. After the game, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know who or what this figure was. I stayed late at the stadium, wandering the halls, hoping to catch another glimpse of them. The place was empty, eerily quiet, and the lights flickered occasionally. I walked down the tunnel where I had seen the figure disappear, my footsteps echoing in the silence. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice, calling my name. My heart raced, and I followed the sound, deeper into the shadows. The voice grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere below the stadium, beneath the stands. I found a door I had never noticed before, slightly ajar, with stairs leading down into the darkness. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I couldn't. I needed answers. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with each step. The whispers surrounded me, soft and sinister, echoing off the walls. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. In the center stood the figure, their back to me. They were still, just as they had been in the crowd, in the street, at my window. But now, they felt more real, more present. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my ears. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw their face. It was mine. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of nightmare. But the figure, my doppelganger, just stood there, staring at me with my own eyes. Their face was expressionless, but there was something in their gaze, something dark and hollow. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, they reached out, pointing at me just like they had on the field. But this time, I felt something cold wash over me, like I was being pulled into a void. My vision blurred, and the room began to spin. I tried to move, but I was frozen in place. Then, everything went black. I don't remember how I got out of the stadium that night. All I know is that I woke up in my apartment, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was gone, but I knew they weren't finished with me. They were still out there, watching, waiting. I quit soccer after that. I couldn't risk it anymore. Every time I even thought about stepping onto the field, I felt that same cold dread wash over me. I couldn't escape the figure's gaze. But even now, months later, I still see them. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of them in the corner of my eye, standing in a crowd, watching me. No matter where I go, they're always there, always watching. I don't know what they want or why they chose me, but I can't escape them. And I don't think I ever will. I started avoiding anything that reminded me of soccer. No matches on TV, no jerseys, nothing. But even as I distanced myself, the feeling of being watched grew worse. I would feel eyes on me in the most mundane situations. At the grocery store, in line at the bank, walking down the street. The figure never got close again, but they were always there, lingering on the edges of my vision, like a shadow I couldn't shake. Sleep became a luxury. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the figure. In my dreams, they weren't just watching anymore. They were chasing me. I'd run through an endless stadium, my legs heavy and slow, but no matter how fast I tried to move, they always caught up. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, and swear I could feel their presence in the room. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real. It was just in my head, a trick of my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever this was, it was more than just a hallucination. It was real. It was happening. Then, one day, everything changed. I was walking through the park near my apartment, trying to clear my mind. It was a quiet morning, with hardly anyone around, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. I even allowed myself to breathe a little easier. Maybe, just maybe, the worst of it was over. But as I turned a corner on the path, I saw them. The figure. They weren't standing in the distance this time. They were right in front of me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. They just stared at me with those dark, empty eyes, my eyes. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped forward, their movements slow and deliberate. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind raced, searching for some kind of explanation, but there was none. I was face to face with myself, or some twisted version of myself. The air around me grew colder, and I felt a crushing weight settle over my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure raised their hand, just like they had done at the stadium, and pointed directly at me. This time, I knew there was no escaping. Something was about to happen, something terrible. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the figure spoke for the first time. It's time. Their voice was a distorted echo of my own, cold and hollow. And with those two words, I felt the world around me shift. The park, the trees, the path, all of it faded into darkness. I was no longer standing in the park. I was back at the stadium, alone on the field, with thousands of empty seats surrounding me. Except it wasn't really empty. The figure stood in the middle of the field, and as I watched in horror, more figures appeared around them. Dozens of them. No hundreds. All of them standing still, all of them watching me. Each one a reflection of myself, their eyes blank, their faces emotionless. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My legs gave way, and I collapsed to the ground, the weight of their stares crushing me. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating, overwhelming. And then they spoke in unison, their voices blending together in a chilling harmony. "Join us." I don't remember much after that. Just darkness. Cold, endless darkness. When I finally came to, I was lying on the field, the stadium lights glaring down at me. The crowd was gone. The figures were gone. But something inside me had changed. I wasn't the same anymore. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it. Like a piece of me had been taken, or maybe replaced. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror later that night, I didn't recognize myself. The eyes staring back at me weren't mine. I don't play soccer anymore. I don't go to stadiums. I don't even leave my apartment if I can avoid it, because no matter where I go, I know they're watching, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to fall back into their grasp. I'm not sure how long I can hold them off. But the worst part, sometimes when I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, I see them staring back. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before I join them. I'd been a book critic for nearly a decade, but nothing quite prepared me for the strange package that arrived one chilly autumn afternoon. It was a plain brown envelope, no return address, no sender name. Inside, I found a novel titled The Abyssal, a title I had never heard of. There was no author's name, no publishing details. It was odd, but the real curiosity lay in the note tucked inside. To be reviewed by you alone. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was some underground indie project. The first chapter followed a woman named Claire who moved to a new town, looking to escape her troubled past. The writing was decent, nothing groundbreaking. I went through about 5 chapters before putting it aside for the day. But that night, I dreamed of a woman standing outside my bedroom window, watching me with vacant eyes. When I picked up The Abyssal the next morning, the plot had shifted. Claire wasn't just running away from her past. Now she was fleeing a faceless figure that stalked her in every shadow. I flipped back to the earlier chapters, convinced I'd somehow misread them. The words had changed. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages. I called a friend in the publishing industry, asking if they'd heard of this book, but they hadn't. Nobody had. Each time I returned to the novel, the story shifted. Claire's surroundings became darker, the faceless figure more menacing. One day, it would be a suspenseful thriller. The next, it had twisted into full-blown horror. The strangest part was that every change felt tailored to me, my fears. The faceless figure seemed to know me, almost as if it was coming for me next. As the days passed, strange things began happening in my own life. The faces of people on the street appeared blurry, like those descriptions in the book. My reflection in the mirror felt off. It didn't blink when I did. I decided to stop reading The Abyssal. But the book didn't like that. That night, I heard rustling, pages turning on their own. I found the book on my desk, open to a new chapter. My name was on the first line. I couldn't escape it. Every attempt to abandon the book felt futile. I tried throwing it out, burning it, but it always found its way back to me, like it was alive. I woke up one morning to find it lying on my chest, the words glowing faintly in the dim light. Claire was no longer the protagonist. I was. The faceless figure began appearing in my dreams again, but now it wasn't outside my window. It was inside my house, closer each time. The book was nearing its end. I felt trapped, a pawn in its narrative. Every page I turned felt like a step toward my own demise. I tried to reach out for help, but everyone around me had forgotten who I was, as if I'd been erased from their memories. My life began to unravel just like the plot of the book. The last chapter was the hardest to read. It wasn't just describing Claire's fate, it was predicting mine. It detailed every step I would take, every desperate attempt I'd make to rid myself of the cursed novel, but it was all in vain. The final sentence read, "The critic turned the last page and became part of the story, never to be heard from again." I felt my hands shaking as I closed the book. It didn't matter. I had no choice but to read it. As I read those final words, I felt a presence behind me. The faceless figure from the book was no longer fiction. It was standing in the doorway of my study, motionless, waiting. I couldn't look away from it, my body frozen in terror. The figure took a step forward, and then another, until it was inches from me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remember was the feeling of icy hands closing around my throat. I don't know how long I've been trapped here, in this endless cycle of pages that shift and twist. The faceless figure is always with me now, lurking in the shadows watching me. I tried to warn others, but no one hears me anymore. I'm part of the story now. And so are you. I've written this in the hopes that someone, anyone, might be able to break free from what I couldn't. I don't know how it works, or why this cursed novel chose me, but I do know one thing: it's alive, feeding off the minds of those who read it. The more you engage with it, the more it shapes itself around your deepest fears, pulling you in until there's no escape. If you ever find The Abyssal on your doorstep, in your mailbox, or simply lying where it shouldn't be, burn it. Don't open it. Don't even look at it. It will do anything to make you read it. But once you do, you're already part of its story. As I sit here, writing these final words, I can hear the pages turning behind me again. They don't stop. I thought I had reached the end, but the book won't let me go. My reflection in the window no longer moves in time with me. The faceless figure is getting closer every day. The next time the book changes, it won't be about me anymore. It will be about you. I feel it now, the weight of the book in my lap, the anticipation of the next page waiting to be turned. You've read this far, haven't you? You're already part of its world. You might think you're safe, that this is just a story. But the plot is shifting as you read this. Look around you. Has anything changed? I've been working as a production assistant on this film set for a couple of months now. It's not glamorous, but it's a foot in the door. Late nights, early mornings, and fetching coffee were all part of the grind. I didn't mind though. It was the thrill of being close to the magic of filmmaking. But what I stumbled upon recently, it's something I'll never forget, something I can't unsee. It started innocently enough. We were filming a horror movie at an old, abandoned theater downtown. The place had been empty for decades, which made it the perfect location. The crew joked about it being haunted, but I wasn't one to believe in that stuff. At least, not back then. One evening, we wrapped up the day's shoot and I was left to tidy up, checking the equipment before locking up. That's when I noticed it, the camera. It was still rolling, or at least I thought it was. I moved to shut it off, but something stopped me. The display showed footage that wasn't right. The scene playing out on the small monitor wasn't part of today's shoot. It wasn't anything we filmed. I stared at it, my heart beginning to race. The footage was in black and white, grainy, like an old movie. In the shot, a woman was standing on the stage of the theater, but there was no one else there with her. No crew, no lights, nothing. I leaned in closer, squinting at the screen. The woman looked distressed, pacing back and forth. Then she stopped suddenly and looked directly into the camera, as if she knew I was watching. Her eyes were hollow dark. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The whole thing felt wrong, like I was intruding on something that was never meant to be seen. Shaking my head, I hit rewind, figuring it was some kind of glitch. Maybe someone had loaded old footage into the camera by mistake. But when I replayed it, the same thing happened. The woman, the stage, the stare. Only this time, there was a whisper. I couldn't make out what she said, but it sent a chill down my spine. I turned the camera off and practically ran out of the theater that night. That night, I didn't sleep much. The image of the woman's face haunted me. I kept telling myself it was just a mistake, something explainable. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next day, I decided to bring it up with the director. Hey, something weird happened last night with one of the cameras, I said, trying to sound casual as we grabbed coffee before the shoot. The director raised an eyebrow. Weird how? There was footage on it that we didn't film. A woman on stage, alone, black and white. He frowned, clearly not amused. You sure you didn't mix up the tapes? Could be some stock footage or something. I wanted to believe that. Maybe. I'll check again today. When we got back to the set, I went straight to the camera. The moment I turned it on, my blood ran cold. The footage was still there. The woman was still there. But this time she wasn't alone. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, I could see someone or something moving behind her. I rewound the footage, my hands trembling, and played it back again. The figure was clearer now, a tall, dark silhouette, looming closer to the woman. She didn't seem to notice it, but I could feel the tension building, like whatever it was watching her. Watching me. I took the camera to the director, the urgency clear in my voice. You need to see this. He was skeptical but followed me anyway. I played the footage for him. He watched in silence, his expression changing from bored indifference to confusion. When the woman appeared on screen, pacing again, he leaned in. Who the hell is that? He muttered under his breath. I don't know. She wasn't here yesterday. None of this was. We watched in eerie silence as the dark figure moved closer to the woman. This time, the whisper was clearer. Help me, she said, her voice faint but desperate. The director pulled back, shaking his head. Cut the crap. This is some kind of prank, right? Did you set this up? I couldn't blame him for not believing me, but I shook my head vehemently. I swear I didn't touch anything. This just appeared. He stared at the screen, his jaw clenched, then sighed. Fine, we'll switch out the camera. This one's obviously busted. The rest of the day went by without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. When we wrapped for the night, I found myself drawn back to the camera we'd set aside. I had to know. I had to see if the footage was still there. I took a deep breath and turned it on. There she was, the woman, only this time she wasn't on stage. She was standing in the audience, looking directly at me through the lens. Her mouth opened again, and this time I heard it clearly. Why didn't you help me? My stomach twisted. I turned to leave, but the camera caught my eye again. The woman was gone. In her place was the dark figure, standing where she had been, its face obscured. Slowly, it turned its head toward the camera. Toward me. I stumbled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. I had to get out of there. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. My mind raced with possibilities. Who was she? What did she want? Why was she asking for help? The next day, I came back to the set early, determined to find out more. I scoured the theater's history, digging through old records, trying to piece together any connection to what I'd seen. That's when I found it. A news article, dated decades ago, about a woman who had gone missing during a production at this very theater. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She was a local actress, rehearsing for the lead role when she vanished without a trace. The case had gone cold, and she was presumed dead. I stared at her photo in the article, my heart sinking. It was her. The woman in the footage. I had no doubt about it now, but that wasn't the worst part. The article mentioned a rumor that had circulated at the time, something about a shadowy figure seen lurking backstage during rehearsals. No one had ever figured out who or what it was. I went back to the set that night, knowing I was about to do something incredibly stupid. But I had to see it through. I took the camera and set it up, pointing it toward the stage, just like before. Then I pressed record. For hours, nothing happened. I sat there, watching the empty stage, feeling like a fool. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But just as I was about to pack up, the lights flickered. I froze. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost suffocating pressure. The camera beeped, its lens slowly zooming in on the stage, even though I wasn't touching it. And then she appeared. Evelyn. She was standing in the center of the stage, just like before, but this time she wasn't pacing. She stood perfectly still, staring directly at me. Her lips moved, forming the words again, "Help me." Before I could react, the dark figure emerged behind her, moving faster than I'd ever seen it. It reached for her, its hand wrapping around her throat, and as she gasped for air, her eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to help her, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body frozen in place. The figure tightened its grip, and with one final, desperate glance, Evelyn vanished, swallowed by the darkness. The camera fell silent, its display flickering off. I don't work on that set anymore. After that night, I handed in my resignation. The director thinks I just couldn't handle the stress. Maybe he's right, but every time I close my eyes, I see her face. I hear her whisper, and sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still feel her watching me through the lens of every camera I pass. I've tried to forget, but something tells me I never will. Whatever was haunting that camera, it's still out there, capturing scenes that were never meant to be seen. And I'll always wonder if one day it'll capture me too. I quit working on that film set, but the feeling of unease followed me. Every time I stepped outside or sat in a room with a camera nearby, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching, waiting. Weeks passed, and I did my best to return to a normal routine, but the nightmares were relentless. Every night, I saw Evelyn's face, her eyes pleading for help that I couldn't give. I tried to move on, to convince myself it was just a freak coincidence, a technical glitch, or my imagination running wild. But then the calls started. At first, it was once or twice a week, late at night, always from an unknown number. I'd pick up, but there was never any sound on the other end, just silence. I told myself it was a prank, but deep down, I knew something else was going on. The calls became more frequent, and then one night I heard it. Its voice, faint and distorted, crackling through the speaker. "Why didn't you help me?" I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. It couldn't be her, it just couldn't. But the next night, the same thing happened. Only this time, it wasn't just a voice. There was static, followed by a low hum, like the sound of an old film reel starting up. And then, I heard footsteps, faint but growing closer. I hung up terrified. From that point on, everything escalated. I'd see fleeting shadows in the corners of my apartment, always just out of sight. The reflection in my bathroom mirror would sometimes shift, showing a glimpse of something that shouldn't have been there, Evelyn's hollow eyes staring back at me. My own reflection twisted, distorted. One night, as I was sitting in my living room, the television flickered on by itself. Static filled the screen, and then, just like in the footage I'd seen at the theater, a black and white image appeared. It was the stage, empty at first, but then Evelyn stepped into view. This time, there was no whisper, no pleading. She simply stared at me, her expression one of sorrow and accusation. And then, the dark figure appeared behind her once again, moving toward me through the screen. My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled to turn the TV off, but the remote wouldn't work. The screen went black only when the figure was inches from her. I stood there, panting, too scared to move. A knock on the door echoed through the apartment, loud and sudden. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. There was no way anyone could be there. It was the middle of the night, and I hadn't invited anyone over. The knock came again, more insistent this time. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. When I opened it, no one was there. But sitting on the floor in front of the door was something I never wanted to see again. It was the camera from the theater, sitting perfectly in the middle of my hallway, the lens pointed directly at me. I slammed the door shut, my pulse racing. How did it get here? Who brought it? I didn't care. I grabbed it, intending to throw it away, to get rid of it for good. But when I touched it, the screen lit up, showing the same footage. Only this time, I was in it. There I was, sitting in my living room, staring at the TV, just like I had moments ago. The dark figure loomed behind me, its face still obscured, but I knew what it wanted. It wasn't just after Evelyn. It was after me. The camera screen flickered, and suddenly, I saw my future, my reflection twisted, my own eyes hollow and empty, just like hers. And then the figure reached out from the screen, its hand pressing against the glass, closer and closer. I dropped the camera, backing away in terror, but it was too late. The last thing I remember is the feeling of cold hands wrapping around my throat, pulling me into the darkness. They'd found the camera next to my body in my apartment, still recording. But the footage, it'll never be seen. Not by anyone who wants to survive. They say a new production assistant picked up the job after I left. I wonder if they've checked the footage yet. I wonder if they'll see what I saw. Maybe this time, the camera will finally get what it wants. Maybe this time, it'll capture them. You know, teaching martial arts can be fulfilling. You watch students come in, some nervous, others eager, and you witness their transformation over time. Their confidence grows, their movements become sharper, and you see the discipline and respect martial arts demands shaping them into better versions of themselves. I've been doing this for over 10 years, and I thought I'd seen it all. That was until Jonah walked into my dojo. Jonah was quiet from the start, but it wasn't the usual kind of quiet. You know how some kids are shy, unsure of themselves? He wasn't like that. He just observed. His eyes scanned the room, always studying the other students, and when he spoke, it was with a kind of detached calm that didn't fit his age. He couldn't have been more than 17. I remember his first day vividly. As I demonstrated a basic punch technique, I noticed something strange. Jonah's body moved almost imperceptibly, just a split second, before I gave the instruction. At first, I thought it was coincidence. Maybe he had trained elsewhere and knew what was coming next. But the more I taught, the more I noticed it. He didn't just anticipate the moves, he knew them before I even formed the words in my mind. It unsettled me, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was reading too much into it. As weeks passed, Jonah progressed faster than any student I'd ever seen. It was uncanny, almost unnatural. The other students took months to grasp techniques, but Jonah? He mastered them in days. Every time I demonstrated something, he mirrored it perfectly before I finished speaking. I tried testing him with unfamiliar techniques, things he couldn't have possibly learned elsewhere, but the result was always the same. He moved with perfect timing, as if we were connected somehow. One evening after class, I decided to ask him about it. I waited until everyone else had left and approached him while he was putting away his gear. "Jonah," I said, "I've noticed something. You seem to know the moves before I even give the instruction. Have you trained before?" He looked up at me, his face calm, but his eyes, there was something dark in them. "No, sensei," he replied quietly. "I've never trained anywhere else." "Then how do you explain?" Before I could finish, Jonah smiled, a thin, unsettling smile. "I just understand things," he said cryptically. Something about his tone chilled me to the bone. Over the next few weeks, Jonah's behavior became even more peculiar. It wasn't just his ability to anticipate my instructions. He seemed to know things, personal things about me, about the other students, things he couldn't possibly know. One evening, while we were practicing sparring, Jonah whispered something to one of the other students, Alex. I didn't catch what he said, but whatever it was caused Alex to freeze mid-movement. His face went pale, and he stumbled back as if Jonah had struck him, though they hadn't made contact. "Everything all right, Alex?" I asked. Alex shook his head, visibly shaken. "I don't feel good," he muttered before hurrying off the mat, leaving the class early. I confronted Jonah after class that night. "What did you say to Alex?" Jonah looked at me with that same unsettling calm. I just told him the truth. "And what truth is that?" I pressed. "He's not going to live to see his 18th birthday," Jonah said without flinching. I felt a knot form in my stomach. "What the hell are you talking about?" Jonah just shrugged. "It's what I see. I see things, Sensei. I see the future. I see what's going to happen before it happens." I didn't know how to respond to that. I wanted to dismiss it as nonsense, but the look in his eyes, the absolute certainty, sent a chill down my spine. Days later, Alex was involved in a terrible car accident. He survived, but barely. His parents pulled him from the dojo after that, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Jonah had somehow known it would happen. Jonah's presence started to affect the whole class. The other students avoided him, and even I found myself growing uneasy whenever he was near. He never threatened anyone, never said anything overtly menacing, but there was something about him, something wrong. One night, after everyone had left, Jonah stayed behind again. I hadn't asked him to, but he lingered, watching me as I cleaned up the dojo. The air felt thick, heavy, as if some invisible force was pressing down on me. "Sensei," he said, his voice breaking the silence, "you don't believe me, do you?" I didn't know how to respond. Believe what? That I can see things, that I know things. I put down the equipment I was holding and turned to face him. "Jonah, I don't know what's going on with you, but you need to stop this. It's scaring the other students." Jonah smiled again, that same eerie smile that never reached his eyes. "You're scared too, aren't you?" I didn't answer, but he knew. Of course he knew. "Sensei," he continued, stepping closer, "I've seen what happens to you. Do you want to know?" My heart started racing. "What are you talking about?" His smile widened, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who had already accepted something terrible. "You die tonight." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there frozen, staring at him. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just said. "That's not funny, Jonah." "I'm not joking," he said, his voice eerily calm. "It's going to happen. I've already seen it." I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. "Go home, Jonah." He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with those dark, knowing eyes. I said, "Go home." Finally, Jonah turned and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused and glanced back at me. "It doesn't matter if you believe me, Sensei. It's already decided." With that, he walked out into the night, leaving me alone in the dojo. I tried to shake off the feeling of dread, but his words echoed in my head. "You die tonight." It was ridiculous. I wasn't going to die tonight. Jonah was just messing with me, trying to get inside my head. I went about locking up the dojo, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. But every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the overhead lights made my heart race faster. I locked the front door and turned off the lights, but as I stepped outside, I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Sensei." I spun around, but the street was empty. There was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest as I started walking toward my car, my keys shaking in my hand. Then I saw him, Jonah, standing in the middle of the street, staring at me. His face was blank, his eyes dark and hollow. "Jonah," I shouted. "Go home." He didn't move. He just stood there watching me. I took a step toward him, but then something strange happened. The air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. The streetlights flickered, and the shadows around Jonah seemed to stretch, twisting and writhing like living things. A sharp pain shot through my chest, and I staggered back, gasping for breath. My heart felt like it was being crushed, like something was squeezing the life out of me. I dropped to my knees, clutching my chest, and looked up at Jonah. He was still standing there watching, as if he had been expecting this all along. "I told you," he said softly, "it's already decided." The last thing I saw was his face, the calm, emotionless face of someone who knew exactly how this was going to end. Then everything went black. I don't believe in curses or supernatural things. I'm a professional athlete, a tennis player. My life revolves around schedules, training, and muscle memory, so anything that seems out of the ordinary is just a matter of finding an explanation, right? That was until I started playing on Court 13. It started last year. I was preparing for a local tournament, nothing major but a good warm-up before the big tour. It was an outdoor venue with nice courts. The day was bright, the weather perfect. I was feeling good, until my racket strings snapped mid-serve. I thought it was a fluke. Racket strings break all the time, especially if you're hitting hard. No big deal. But when I swapped to a backup racket, it happened again. Same serve, same point in the match. I'd just gone up 3-2 in the first set. Snap. I laughed it off with my coach afterward, blaming cheap strings or wear and tear from practice. But when it kept happening, only on that court, at the exact same score, every time, I couldn't brush it off anymore. By the fourth tournament, I'd stopped laughing. I'd run through nearly all my rackets in just one match. The crowd thought I was nervous, maybe overworking myself. But deep down, I felt something different. The racket wouldn't just snap, it felt like something was pulling at the strings. Like an unseen force was yanking them apart, thread by thread, and it was only happening on Court 13. I became obsessed with understanding why. My coach told me to forget about it. He said players have their quirks, their rituals. Maybe this court wasn't my lucky one, but it wasn't just that. I started noticing other things. The wind, for one. The way it seemed to shift right before my racket would break. I could swear I heard a whisper faint, like someone muttering under their breath, just before the strings would give way. I chalked it up to nerves. But then I started dreaming about it, about that court. I'd be playing a match in my sleep, my body going through the motions, but when I hit that same serve at 3-2, everything would shift. The world would go silent. My racket would freeze in midair. And then I'd hear it, clear as day, someone calling my name. In one dream, I saw the figure. It was standing at the far end of the court, just behind the baseline. Tall, shadowy, and faceless. When I woke up, I was covered in sweat. The next day, I told myself it was all in my head. I was pushing too hard, letting the pressure get to me. But when I returned to Court 13 for another tournament, something strange happened. I saw the same figure, standing where it had been in my dream. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the court. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching. I felt an icy chill crawl up my spine, even though the day was hot. My serve wobbled, and just like every time before, snap. My racket broke. The crowd gasped, but all I could do was stare at the end of the court, where the figure had been. It was gone. After that, I started avoiding Court 13 altogether. I told the tournament organizers that I preferred playing elsewhere. It worked for a while. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. No matter what court I played on, if the score reached 3-2 in the first set, I'd start to feel the wind shift. The whisper would come back. And even though my racket didn't break, it felt like a warning. One night, I decided to investigate. I snuck into the complex after hours. Court 13 was empty, the moon casting long shadows over the surface. I brought a racket just to see what would happen. As soon as I stepped onto the court, the temperature seemed to drop. I could hear the wind again, though there wasn't any breeze. I called out, half expecting to see the figure. Nothing. I hit a few balls, serving like I would in a match. It felt good at first, my body going through the familiar motions. Then I hit the serve, the one that always broke my strings. Snap. The racket flew out of my hand, yanked away as if an invisible force had ripped it from my grip. I stumbled back, heart racing, staring at the spot where my racket had landed. And then I saw it, the figure, standing at the far end of the court, exactly where it had been in my dreams. Now, every time I play, I know it's there watching. I've stopped trying to fight it. There's no point. I keep hearing that whisper louder now. Every match on Court 13 feels like a countdown, and I'm terrified of what will happen when the strings break for the final time. Because I know, deep down, that when they do, I won't be able to leave the court. Not this time. I stood frozen, staring at the shadowy figure at the end of the court. It didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. My heart pounded, the silence around me deafening. The racket lay in the middle of the court, strings shredded, the same way it always happened at 3-2. I wanted to run, but something kept me there, like my feet were stuck to the ground. I took a step forward, toward the racket, half expecting the figure to vanish like it always did in my nightmares. But it stayed, a dark silhouette, almost blending into the night. The air felt thick, suffocating. I bent down to pick up the racket, my hand trembling as I wrapped my fingers around the grip. The second I touched it, the wind came out of nowhere, gusting across the court, carrying with it a voice. Not a whisper this time. A full-blown, chilling voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. You should have left. I dropped the racket like it burned my skin. My pulse quickened, panic rising. I backed away, eyes darting to the figure, which still hadn't moved. But something was different now. The shadows around it began to shift, swirling as if alive. They crawled toward me, stretching across the court, swallowing the lines and the net. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the asphalt as I sprinted toward the gate, but the wind howled in my ears, louder and louder. The shadows crept closer, chasing me, pulling me back. I couldn't outrun them. My vision blurred as I neared the edge of the court, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground, just outside Court 13. My racket was next to me, perfectly intact. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed it all, but the chill in my bones told me otherwise. The figure, the voice, the shadows, they were real. I wanted to leave, to get away from the court forever, but something was pulling me back. It was like an invisible chain had wrapped itself around me, tugging me toward the court. I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. I had to know what was happening, what it wanted. The next morning, I went to the tournament organizers and demanded answers. I asked them if anything strange had happened on Court 13 before. At first, they were reluctant, but after some pressing, one of the older staff members pulled me aside. "There's a reason we don't use that court much anymore," he said, his voice low. A long time ago, a young tennis player died there during a match. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened? He hesitated before continuing. He was just starting his career, full of promise, but during a critical match, his racket broke, same as yours, and in the final set, he collapsed. Hype attack, they said, but there were rumors. People said they saw something on the court with him. Some even claimed to hear him screaming in the wind afterward. I felt sick. The pieces were falling into place. The voice, the figure, the strings breaking, was it him? Was the court haunted by the spirit of the player who died there? After that conversation, I should have stayed away. Any sane person would have. But I couldn't. It was as if Court 13 had its hooks in me, dragging me back for one final match. The next tournament was my last. I stepped onto Court 13, knowing what was coming. My coach tried to talk me out of it, but I insisted. I had to play, one last time. My opponent looked nervous, probably sensing the tension in the air. The crowd was smaller than usual, but I didn't care. The match started off like any other. My serves were solid, and I took the lead early. 3-2 came quickly, and with it, the familiar dread. I gripped my racket tightly, feeling the tension in the strings. I could hear the wind again, that soft whisper warning me. But I didn't stop. I served the ball, clean, fast, perfect. Snap. The racket broke, the strings unraveling in my hand, just like before. The crowd gasped, but I didn't care. My eyes were on the figure at the end of the court. It was back, standing in the same spot, waiting. This time, I walked toward it. As I crossed the court, the air grew colder, the wind howling louder. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. The shadows swirled around my feet, pulling me in. I stopped just a few feet away, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're not supposed to be here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to the figure or myself. The figure tilted its head, as if considering my words. Then, in a voice that echoed in my mind, it spoke. "I've been a swing dance instructor for the better part of a decade, and I've seen all kinds of students come and go. Some are naturals, others need a bit of patience, and then there are the ones who need. A little extra help, you could say. But no one had ever given me the kind of chills that Olivia did. The first time she stepped into my studio, she moved with an ease that was almost unnatural. She claimed to be a beginner, but the way her feet glided across the floor suggested otherwise. I'm usually good at spotting talent, but something about her stood out, something I couldn't quite place. And then there was the way she always seemed to move ahead of the beat. It wasn't by much, just a second or two, but it was enough to notice. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. It happens with new students sometimes. They get excited and try to anticipate the music. But as weeks passed, it became clear that Olivia wasn't just anticipating the beat. She knew what was coming, even before I called out the steps. It was as if she had rehearsed the entire lesson plan without me. One evening during a class, I paired her with different partners. Every single time, she moved just a little faster than the music, her steps perfectly aligned with the next beat, as if she was dancing to a song only she could hear. I pulled her aside afterward, trying to keep my tone light. "You're picking this up pretty quickly, aren't you?" She smiled, a small, almost secretive smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I guess it just comes naturally." I let it go for the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Olivia than she let on. Every time she danced, there was an energy to her movements, like she was performing a routine she had already practiced 1,000 times. Yet I was certain she hadn't. Weeks went by, and Olivia became a regular in my advanced classes. She never missed a session, and she always paired herself with whoever was left without a partner. No one ever complained, but I noticed they often seemed tired after dancing with her. It was subtle at first, slight looks of confusion, a hand briefly pressed to a temple as if trying to ward off a headache. I assumed it was just coincidence. But then there was that night. It was late, well after class had ended, and I was locking up the studio. The place was empty, and the echoes of the day's music still seemed to hang in the air. I was just about to flip the lights off when I heard it, a soft shuffle of footsteps, the sound of dancing shoes on the hardwood floor. I froze, straining to listen. There it was again. Light, almost graceful, but definitely the sound of someone dancing. "Hello," I called out, walking back toward the main studio. The lights were dim, but I could make out the silhouette of a figure in the middle of the dance floor. As I stepped closer, I realized who it was, Olivia, moving through the steps of a routine I hadn't taught her. In fact, I hadn't taught anyone these steps. The room felt colder than it should have, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as I watched her dance alone with no music. The strangest part was how perfectly in time she seemed to be, even though the room was silent. It was like she was hearing a rhythm from somewhere else. "Olivia?" My voice came out quieter than I intended. She stopped abruptly and turned to face me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, with that same secretive smile, she walked over, her heels tapping against the floor in perfect rhythm. "Sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to stay so late." "No problem," I replied, trying to hide the unease in my voice. "But what were you doing?" There wasn't any music playing. She tilted her head, studying me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I didn't need the music. I know the steps." That's when the light bulb above us flickered, just for a second, but enough to catch my attention. I glanced up at it, but when I looked back at her, she was already walking away, heading toward the door. As soon as she left, I felt like I could breathe again. The next few days were tense. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about how Olivia had moved so fluidly without any music, as if she was following some invisible tune. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the feeling lingered like a shadow that wouldn't leave. Then came the recital. Every year, my students put on a performance for friends and family, showcasing what they've learned. Olivia was set to perform a solo, and I had been dreading it. Something about her dancing in front of an audience just didn't sit right with me. The night of the recital arrived, and the studio was packed. Olivia waited backstage, calm and composed as ever. When her name was called, she stepped onto the floor, the lights dimming around her. The music began, a classic swing tune, one that I had heard 100 times before. But Olivia wasn't dancing to the music. She was ahead of it, moving just a fraction of a second faster, her feet hitting the floor before the beat even dropped. It was unnerving, watching her glide across the stage as if she already knew how the song would end. And then the lights flickered. Just like that night in the studio, the overhead lights blinked once, then twice. The audience didn't seem to notice, but I did. I stood frozen at the back of the room, my eyes glued to Olivia as she danced faster, her movements becoming more frantic. Suddenly, the music cut out. The room was silent, but Olivia kept moving, her steps growing more and more wild. The air around her seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off a summer road. She twirled faster, her arms outstretched, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. She wasn't alone. I don't know how to describe it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games, but there were other figures on the stage with her. Shadowy, blurred outlines of people, all dancing in perfect sync with her. Their movements were sharp, inhuman, like they were being pulled by invisible strings. The audience remained silent, their eyes locked on Olivia, oblivious to what was happening. I wanted to shout, to stop the performance, but I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my throat dry and tight. Olivia spun faster, her shadowy partners matching her every move, and then, with a final leap, she collapsed to the floor. The lights flickered one last time, then went out completely. There was a moment of stillness, the kind that feels like it stretches on for hours. When the lights came back on, Olivia was lying motionless on the stage, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The shadows were gone, and the audience slowly began to clap, confused but relieved that the performance had ended. I rushed to the stage, kneeling beside her. "Olivia." I shook her gently, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "We need to get her to a hospital," someone shouted from the audience. But as I looked down at her, I realized there was no point. Olivia wasn't hurt. She wasn't unconscious. She was gone. Her body was there, but whatever made her Olivia had vanished, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I closed the studio after that night. I couldn't keep teaching, not after what happened. The official report said she had suffered a mental breakdown, but I knew better. I saw what happened. I saw the shadows, the way they danced with her, pulled her, claimed her. Every now and then, I hear the music again. It's faint, like a distant memory, but when I hear it, I know what it means. I know that Olivia is still out there somewhere, dancing to a rhythm none of us can hear. But it's not just her anymore. I think they're coming for me next.